When Thomas Malthus wrote in his essay on populations, gigantic inevitable famine stalks in the rear, and with one mighty blow levels the population with the food of the world, he was speaking about the scarcity of resources available to humans on the earth. It was ideas like this that helped Charles Darwin devise the theory of evolution by natural selection, by focusing on the scarcity of resources and competition for these scarce resources. Both of these are things that drive regulation of populations and control their growth. In this lesson, we'll learn about the factors that control population growth and help regulate it so that the homeostasis of ecosystems is maintained. If you're ready to learn about regulating population growth, let's get started. The learning objectives for this lesson are that after this lesson you will be able to refine scientific models and questions about the effect of complex biotic and abiotic interactions on all biological systems, from cells and organisms to populations, communities, and ecosystems. You'll be able to justify the selection of the kind of data needed to answer scientific questions about the interaction of populations within communities. You'll be able to predict the effects of a change in the community's populations on the community. And finally, you'll be able to predict the effects of a change of matter or energy availability on communities. In our previous lesson, we examined the two different types of population growth that can occur: exponential and logistic. But regardless of the type of growth that occurs, understand this: populations do not and cannot grow infinitely. There are multiple factors that limit and regulate population growth. And in this lesson, we'll explore the factors that regulate population growth. First, let's talk about life history components. An organism's life history includes the events that shape an organism's lifetime: how the organism uses environmental resources, how the organism balances its energy budget, and what the organism's reproductive capability is. When considering regulation of population growth, reproductive capability includes four components. First, reproductive capacity, or what is called fecundity. How many offspring can be produced if the individual has as many offspring as is possible? And how many times can this be repeated after the birth of the offspring? Fecundity has an inverse relationship with parental investment. The more offspring an individual has, the less time and energy the organism has to care for the offspring. Consequently, little care is given to these offspring, and often many of them do not survive. Offspring are able to care for themselves at an early age. The opposite is true of organisms that produce small numbers of offspring. If they're producing small numbers of offspring, they're going to have more energy to devote to caring for those offspring, and so many of those offspring will live to reproductive age. Speaking of parental investment is how much time the parent spends caring for its offspring. The members of a species that produce large numbers of offspring per reproductive event do not invest that much time into caring for the offspring, because their energy budget has been used to produce such a large quantity of offspring, so very little energy remains allocated for the care of those offspring. And then the converse is true. If members of a species produce only one or a very few offspring per reproductive event, there's a great deal of energy that can be allocated toward caring for those offspring. And that increases the chances of the survival of those offspring, but it decreases the chances of survival for the parent, since the energy budget has been shifted to caring for the offspring. Reproductive timing. Here you see a picture of 4 seasons. So when we talk about reproductive timing, this talks about when organisms are able to produce offspring. If individuals can reproduce at an early age, they have a greater chance of producing offspring, but there's a trade-off. The lifespan is generally shorter, and there's usually a lack of parental care for those offspring. But if an individual reproduces much later in life, the benefit is that fecundity and parental investment may be increased, but the chances of dying off before reaching reproductive age or not reaching reproductive capacity are increased. And then finally, the number of reproductive events. In other words, how many times an organism reproduces during its lifetime. If an organism reproduces once during its lifetime, then it will expend a great deal of energy to be able to reproduce and may not even survive the reproductive event. For example, what you see here is a picture of a Chinook salmon after it spawned. So when it is spawning season, the Chinook salmon uses most of its energy reserve to swim upstream to mate. And then it dies afterwards, only having mated once in its lifetime. This differs from organisms that mate once annually, but then survive the reproductive event. These organisms often have a specific season during which mating occurs due to the timing of reproductive hormones being released. There are other factors that contribute to population regulation that are related to life history. Organisms that exhibit what is known as K-selection reach sexual maturity late in their lives. These organisms tend to be larger in size. They also have large offspring that are immature at birth that require a great deal of parental care late into their lives. K-selected species are found in numbers close to their carrying capacity, which is why they're called K-selected. Remember that K stands for carrying capacity. Intraspecific competition is high among these organisms, as they tend to inhabit stable environments. And the reason why intraspecific competition is high is there's a great deal of competition for the same resources in these environments. Because the numbers are so close to the carrying capacity, they do tend to compete a lot with one another for the same resources. So some examples of K-selected species are primates, such as humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and other large mammals such as whales, cows, and then in plants, oak trees are a good example. And what you see here is a right whale and a baby right whale with its mom. Then you have what are called R-selected species. These species are smaller in size. They reach sexual maturity very early on in their life, and they produce large numbers of small, mature offspring that are self-sufficient, so little to no parental care is given. Intraspecific competition is very low due to large numbers of offspring being produced that don't survive a very long time, if at all. So some examples of our selected species are going to be things like marine invertebrates such as jellyfish, like you see in the picture here. It's a Portuguese man of war. Crustaceans such as shrimp, crabs, and crayfish. And then when we talk about plants, dandelions are a great example of an R-selected species. There are also limiting factors that affect population size. The first one we'll talk about is density-dependent limiting factors. These are limiting factors whose effects are dependent upon the size of the population. If a population is particularly dense, then these factors are going to increase mortality rates, and birth rates are going to be lower because competition for resources increases. These factors tend to be biotic factors such as competition, disease, food availability, and waste accumulation. So what you see in the photographs here in the top right, you see what's called a feeding frenzy. All of these fish are competing for the same resources, the same food source, and they're, fighting with one another to eat the food. You also have a jay that's hoarding food, so food availability can become an issue. There might not be enough food, so he's hoarding the food that he has. And then disease. What you see there in the bottom right is an ear of corn that has ear rot. And so remember that each one of those corn kernels represents a potential seed that can become its own corn ear. And so because the diseased ear is covered in rot at the top, that definitely can limit the size of the population of corn that can grow afterward.